The aluminum tab made a sound like a tiny gunshot in the quiet of the backstage corridor. Lumi stood at the vending machine in a dress worth more than her monthly rent, one hand steadying the can of supermarket brand seltzers she'd just purchased with 2 crumpled dollar bills and a quarter she'd found in the bottom of her clutch. The carbonation hissed up at her, and she lifted the can to her lips without checking if anyone was watching. She knew someone was watching. She'd known since the moment she'd stepped out of the town car Julian Voss had sent for her, since the doorman at the Marlowe had called her ma'am with the particular wariness reserved for women whose clothes cost more than his paycheck but whose faces suggested they might not know how to use the correct fork. She'd known because she'd spent the last 3 hours being looked at, appraised, measured, catalogued, by people who assumed she was either a very expensive escort or a very naive community organizer who'd stumbled into the wrong tax bracket. Neither assumption was entirely wrong. Neither was entirely right. She took another sip of her seltzer, letting the bubbles sit on her tongue, and watched a harried server nearly collide with her as he rushed past with a tray of champagne flutes. She sidestepped without spilling a drop, one hand coming up in a small, reflexive gesture of calm. "Easy there," she murmured, not to him, he was already gone, but to the space he'd left behind. The corridor swallowed the sound. That was when she heard footsteps. Measured. Deliberate. The kind of footsteps that belonged to someone who knew exactly how much space they were allowed to take up. "Julian worries you might go off script." The voice came from behind her, low and dry, with the particular texture of someone who'd spent too many nights in rooms like this, saying things like this, to people like her. Lumi didn't turn around immediately. She finished her sip, let the can settle in her hand, and then glanced over her shoulder with the easy patience of someone who had all night. The man standing 3 feet away was tall, dark-haired, and dressed in a suit that fit him the way expensive things fit people who'd learned to wear them properly. His tie was knotted with military precision. His shoes were polished to a gleam that caught the cold crystal light of the corridor. His face was handsome in the way of men who'd been told so often they'd stopped caring, sharp jaw, steady eyes, a mouth that looked like it knew how to smile but had forgotten the mechanics. But it was his eyes that held her. Dark brown, watchful, carrying the weight of a man who'd been paid to see everything and reveal nothing. "Off script," she repeated, turning fully now to face him. The deep blue of her dress caught the light like water at midnight. "That's an interesting choice of words, Mr. Mercer." He didn't flinch at her knowing his name. Of course he didn't. He'd probably read her file before she'd even stepped out of the car. Name, Lumi. Occupation, theater coordinator at the Marlowe Theater. Threat level, moderate. Instructions, monitor. "Is that your professional way of asking if I'm dangerous?" she asked, tilting her head. A strand of dark hair slipped free from the careful arrangement of her updo, and she didn't bother to tuck it back. Evan Mercer's gaze tracked the movement, catalogued it, filed it away. "Are you?" Lumi smiled. It wasn't a dangerous smile, it was too warm for that, too genuine. But there was something in it that made Evan's fingers twitch against the seam of his trousers. Only to men who confuse quiet with permission. She said it lightly, the way you'd comment on the weather or the quality of the champagne. But something in the air shifted between them, a subtle pressure change, the way a room feels different just before the first crack of thunder. Evan's hand came up to adjust his tie, a nervous habit he thought he'd killed years ago. "You're supposed to be in the green room," he said, steering back to professional territory. "Mr. Voss's assistant is looking for you." They want to run through the remarks one more time. Remarks. She said the word like she was tasting it. That's a very diplomatic word for a list of things someone else decided I should say. Diplomacy is what I do. Is it? She took a step closer, not invading his space but entering it carefully, deliberately, like a guest who'd been invited but wanted to check the welcome mat for thorns. "I thought you were a crisis consultant." "Same job. Different title." Same job, she echoed, and there was no judgment in her voice, which made it worse, somehow. Managing people's discomfort. Making sure nothing embarrassing happens. Keeping the powerful in their seats and the powerless in their assigned places. Evan's jaw tightened. You've done your research. I didn't have to. You're wearing your job like a second skin. She gestured vaguely at his suit. The perfectly pressed jacket. The watch that cost more than my car. The way you stand, like you're waiting for someone to ask a question you've already prepared the answer for. She was looking at him now with those sharp, quiet eyes, and he felt something he hadn't felt in years, the uncomfortable sensation of being truly seen. Not looked at was easy. He'd been looked at by photographers and interview subjects and clients who needed to believe his calm was real. This was different. This was someone reading the footnotes of his life without asking for permission. You missed the part about billable hours, he said, because deflection was easier than honesty. Did I? She smiled again, softer this time, and something in that smile made him think she wasn't buying what he was selling. That sounds like the part you've practiced. He opened his mouth to respond, with what, he wasn't sure, but the corridor speakers crackled to life, announcing the final call for guests to take their seats in the main ballroom. The jazz band had started warming up, the muffled thump of a bass line bled through the walls. Lumi looked past him, toward the sound. Her expression shifted, just slightly, the way a window's reflection changes when a cloud passes overhead. I should go, she said, and it wasn't an escape, exactly, but it was a closing of the door he'd been trying to wedge open. She moved past him, closer than she needed to, and he caught the scent of her, something floral and clean, undercut by the faint metallic tang of the seltzer she was still holding. She paused at the door leading into the ballroom, one hand on the brass handle. Mr. Mercer. Yes? The theater I work at has a leaky roof. She said it without self-pity, without the calculated vulnerability of someone fishing for sympathy. Just a fact. The kids sit on old folding chairs and still laugh like they own the place. I'm not sure that fits in a soundbite. She pushed open the door, and the warm golden light of the ballroom spilled out into the corridor, illuminating the dust motes suspended in the air between them. For a moment, he saw her silhouette against that light, the elegant line of her back, the ribbon of her dress tied in a perfect bow at the base of her spine, the way she held herself like someone who'd learned to take up space without making a fuss about it. Then the door swung shut, and she was gone. Evan stood in the corridor for a long moment, the metallic taste of her seltzer somehow still in the air. He pulled out his phone and typed a quick message to Julian's assistant, "She's going in. I'll monitor from the wings." The assistant responded almost immediately, "Keep her on script. 3 minutes. No deviations." Evan stared at the message until the screen went dark, then pocketed the phone and followed her into the ballroom. His first impression of the ballroom had been how much money it cost to make something look effortless. The crystal chandeliers dripped from the ceiling like frozen fountains. The tablecloths were heavy enough to double as blankets, and the centerpieces, exotic flowers that probably cost more than the florist's rent, scattered their fragrance across the cavernous space. The jazz band was tucked into a corner, playing something smooth and expensive, the kind of music that was designed to be heard but not listened to. His second impression was how small Lumi looked in the middle of it all. She'd been placed at Julian's right hand, which was both a compliment and a cage. From his position in the shadows near the stage-left curtains, Evan could see the way Julian leaned toward her occasionally, his white smile fixed in place, his hand occasionally touching her elbow in a gesture meant to convey warmth but reading as ownership. Lumi was smiling too, that same pleasant, public smile she'd worn earlier, but Evan noticed she was barely touching her champagne glass. Just holding it. Weighing it. Letting the bubbles rise and burst. The speeches began. The usual parade of donors and board members and local politicians, each one rising to praise Julian Voss's vision and his commitment and his unwavering dedication to enriching the cultural landscape of our great city. The words were hollow, Evan knew, because he'd helped write half of them. The other half were variations on the same theme. Julian Voss is a generous man, a visionary man, a man who understands that the old ways must sometimes give way to the new. Which was another way of saying, we're tearing down the Marlowe Theatre and building luxury condos, but we've put a fresh coat of paint on the messaging so you'll clap anyway. Evan had made peace with this kind of work years ago. Or so he'd told himself. He'd stood at the back of 100 rooms like this, watching 100 powerful men spin 100 beautiful lies, and he'd convinced himself that the truth was never as clean as the fiction, that everyone needed someone to manage the narrative, that he wasn't doing anything wrong, he was just doing what was necessary. That was the lie he told himself, anyway. And then he'd met Lumi, and the lie had started to fray at the edges. The ballroom had a long, rectangular shape, with one wall made entirely of windows that overlooked the rain-slicked city below. The rain had been falling steadily all evening, turning the streets into mirrors of neon and headlights, and every now and then Evan caught himself glancing at the windows instead of the speakers, watching the way the city dissolved and reformed itself in the dark glass. He was doing that now, letting his attention drift, when he heard the question that made his stomach drop. Mr. Voss, can you speak to the specific timeline for the theater's renovation? There have been rumors about a change in scope. The journalist, a young woman with sharp glasses and an even sharper gaze, had stood up from her seat near the press table and was holding her recorder like a weapon. Julian's smile didn't waver, but Evan saw the slight tightening around his eyes, the fractional delay before he answered. Of course, of course. Julian leaned forward, all charm and confidence. We're aiming for a phased approach. First, we'll address the structural issues, the roof, the foundation, then we'll begin the modernization efforts. The goal is to preserve the theater's historical character while updating it for 21st century audiences. Evan's eyes went to Lumi. She was watching Julian with the same patient, attentive expression she'd worn all evening, but her hand was moving. She'd set down her champagne glass, and her fingers were resting on the stem of the wine glass beside it, and as Julian spoke, as he said the words preserve the historical character, she tapped the glass once, lightly, so that it produced a tiny, crystalline note. No one else seemed to hear it. But Evan heard it. And when her eyes found his across the room, there was something in them that made him feel like he'd been caught in a lie. That's not true, that little tap said. That's not what's happening. And she was right. He knew she was right. The truth Julian had paid him to keep quiet, the truth that was buried in the files he'd been reviewing all week, was that the theater was coming down. Every last brick. The roof, the foundation, the creaky old stage where children had performed their first plays and old lovers had held hands in the dark. All of it, leveled to make room for glass and steel and people who would never know what they'd replaced. He moved before he'd consciously decided to, stepping out of the shadows and crossing to the journalist's table with the smooth, practiced professionalism of a man who'd been asked to make problems disappear. Excuse me, he said, his voice low and pleasant, the kind of voice that was designed to de-escalate. I'm Evan Mercer, Mr. Voss's communications director. I'd be happy to give you a more detailed breakdown of the renovation timeline after the speeches. We have a press packet that covers all the specifics. The journalist looked at him, skeptical but not hostile. I'd rather hear it from Mr. Voss. Of course. But he's scheduled to introduce the next speaker momentarily, and I'd hate for you to miss the full context. He smiled, warm and unthreatening. I promise. The packet is quite thorough. I wrote it myself. It was a lie. He'd barely glanced at the press packet, which was full of carefully curated half-truths, but it was a lie she was willing to accept. She nodded, sat down, and Evan retreated to the wings with the quiet satisfaction of a crisis averted. He didn't look at Lumi as he passed her table. But he felt her gaze on him, and when he reached the safety of the shadows, he allowed himself to breathe. The band moved into a slower number as the speeches wound down and the dinner service began. Evan had been positioned near the stage, close enough to intervene if necessary, far enough to fade into the background. It was a spot he knew well, the professional observer, the anonymous fixer, the man who could disappear into any room and emerge with the problem solved. But tonight, he couldn't seem to disappear. His eyes kept returning to Lumi. Not because she was doing anything overtly dangerous, she was eating her salad with the same careful composure she displayed all evening, nodding at the appropriate moments, offering the occasional comment that struck just the right note of polite interest. But there was something about the way she moved, the way she held herself, that suggested she was watching everything with the same intensity he was. She was cataloging, filing, waiting. He remembered her words from the corridor, waiting is a form of listening. He was still thinking about that when Julian's assistant appeared at his elbow, red-faced and agitated. "We have a situation," the assistant hissed, his voice barely above a whisper. Outside. Julian's former partner. Marcus Cole. "He's been drinking, and he's making a scene. Julian wants it handled. Quietly." Evan looked past the assistant, toward the corridor doors. He could already hear the raised voice, not shouting exactly, but loud enough to cut through the careful hum of polite dinner conversation. "Where's security?" "Already there." "But he's not responding to them." "Julian wants you." Evan nodded, already moving. This was what he did. This was the moment he was paid for, the moment when the carefully constructed facade cracked, and someone needed to patch it before anyone noticed. He reached the corridor just as Marcus Cole's voice rose to a near shout. "You son of a bitch! You told me we were going to restore it. You shook my hand and looked me in the eye and told me." Evan rounded the corner and saw the scene, Marcus Cole, red-faced and swaying, held back by two security guards who were clearly trying to be gentle. Julian was nowhere in sight. He'd retreated, as he always did, letting his team clean up the mess. The corridor was lined with onlookers, guests who'd wandered out for air or cigarettes, their faces a mixture of embarrassment and prurient interest. Evan was about to step forward, to do what he'd done 100 times before, calm the angry man, make the problem go away, keep the narrative intact, when someone else moved. Lumi. She'd slipped out of the ballroom without anyone noticing, and she was already crossing the corridor toward Marcus Cole with the unhurried grace of someone attending a small, private party. Her deep blue dress glided across the marble floor, and she reached Marcus just as the security guards tensed to drag him away. "Don't waste the truth by making it look drunk," she said. Her voice was quiet but clear, pitched to carry only as far as it needed to. Marcus stopped struggling, his eyes focusing on her with the blurry confusion of someone who'd expected an enemy and gotten an ally. She took a glass of water from a passing server's tray, Evan hadn't even seen her signal the woman, and pressed it into Marcus's hand. "If you have something real to say," Lumi continued, her voice dropping even lower, so that only Marcus and Evan and the nearest security guards could hear, "say it where people can hear you clearly. Not in a hallway where they can dismiss you before you finish." Marcus blinked, his anger deflating as quickly as it had risen. He took a sip of the water, then another. His shoulders sagged. I thought he was going to keep his word." "I know." Lumi's hand brushed his arm, a brief touch that seemed to steady him. "I know." Evan had stepped closer without realizing it, drawn by something he couldn't name. He watched as Marcus nodded, took another sip of water, and allowed himself to be guided toward the exit by the security guards, who now looked more like helpful escorts than enforcers. The crisis was over. The narrative was intact. Julian's reputation was safe. But Evan couldn't shake the feeling that Lumi hadn't been helping Julian at all. She turned from the retreating figure of Marcus Cole, and her eyes met Evan's across the corridor. She gave the tiniest shake of her head, not quite a warning, not quite a denial, and then she was walking past him, back toward the ballroom, her heels clicking on the marble in a rhythm that was almost musical. As she passed him, she spoke without stopping, her voice barely audible over the hum of the corridor. "See? Waiting is effective." And then she was gone, swallowed by the warm golden light of the ballroom, and Evan was standing in the corridor with his heart beating harder than it had any right to. He'd managed crises before. He'd smoothed over scandals and extinguished fires and made problems disappear with the casual skill of a magician pulling a rabbit from a hat. But this woman who'd stepped into the middle of a scene she had no part in and bent it to her will with nothing but her voice and a glass of water, this was something he didn't know how to file. She wasn't following the script. She wasn't even reading from the same playbook. And the worst part, the part that made Evan's professional instincts scream in protest, was that she'd done it better than he could have. He made his way back to his post in the wings, but his attention was split now, his focus fractured. He watched Lumi return to her seat at Julian's table, watched Julian lean in to whisper something in her ear that made her smile, that public smile, watched her accept the praise with the same quiet poise she displayed all evening. But he noticed that she didn't touch her champagne glass again. And he noticed, too, that when her eyes swept the ballroom, searching, assessing, they always seemed to find him. The auction segment began, and the energy in the room shifted from polite to voracious. Paddles went up for vacation homes and luxury cars and private dinners with celebrities, each bid higher than the last, each gavel fall a small triumph of wealth over taste. Evan had seen it all before. He'd stood in 100 rooms like this, watching 100 auctions of the same goods, expensive things for expensive people, bought and sold with the casual indifference of people who'd never known a price that was truly out of reach. But something was different tonight. Someone was missing. He looked for Lumi and found her near the back of the ballroom, her phone pressed to her ear, her expression unreadable. She was speaking softly, rapidly, her free hand cupping the phone to her ear as if to block out the noise of the room. She'd been gone for 3 minutes. 4. 5. Evan was already moving. He found her in a small anteroom off the main corridor, her back to the door, her voice low and urgent. No, don't call anyone yet. I'll be there first thing in the morning. Just make sure the roof is tarped and the water isn't getting near the electricals. I know it's a long shot, but, she broke off as she heard him enter, spinning around with a flash of surprise that she quickly masked. Her phone was still pressed to her ear, but she murmured a quick goodbye and ended the call. Problem? Evan asked, though he already knew the answer. The roof, she said, sliding the phone into her clutch. The rain's worse than they predicted. There's a leak in the east wing, near the children's rehearsal space. They're trying to contain it, but... She shrugged, a small, helpless gesture that seemed entirely wrong on her. It's an old building. These things happen. You should have told someone. Julian's team could have, she cut him off with a look. Julian's team doesn't care about the roof. Julian's team cares about the press release he's about to make, and the narrative he's about to sell, and the fact that every minute I spend worrying about the actual theater is a minute I'm not smiling prettily in front of the cameras. Her voice was calm, but there was an edge to it now, a thin layer of steel beneath the velvet. Evan took a step closer. You're angry. I'm tired. She said it simply, without self-pity. I'm tired of being used as a prop in someone else's story. I'm tired of pretending this gala is about community when it's really about ego. I'm tired of, she stopped, pressing her lips together, and for a moment she looked so young, so exhausted, that Evan felt something shift in his chest. Lumi. Her name came out soft, unexpected, and she looked at him with a flicker of surprise. Don't, she said, holding up a hand. Don't do the sympathetic thing. I've seen the way you work. The warm voice, the understanding eyes, the careful way you make people feel like they're being heard when you're really just gathering information to use against them later. Is that what you think I'm doing? I think you're very good at your job, she said. And your job is making sure people like Julian Voss never have to face the consequences of their actions. Evan felt the words land like small, precise darts. They hurt because they were true, or at least, because they were close enough to true that he couldn't easily defend himself. Maybe that used to be my job, he said, surprising himself. But I'm starting to think I've managed the wrong things. She looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face with an intensity that made him want to look away. But he didn't. He held her gaze, let her see whatever she was looking for, and waited. I used to be a journalist, he said, the words coming out before he could stop them. A long time ago. I wrote about the kind of stories that never make it to galas like this. The working-class neighborhoods being pushed out by developers. The families who couldn't afford to fight back. The small beauties of a world that was being systematically erased. He paused, swallowing against the sudden tightness in his throat. I stopped because I couldn't make enough money. And then I stopped because I convinced myself that the stories I was telling didn't matter anyway. That there was no point in fighting. That the powerful always win, and the best you can do is find a comfortable position on the winning side. You don't really believe that. It wasn't a question. She said it with the same quiet certainty she'd brought to everything else tonight, as though she could see straight through his armor and into the truth he'd been hiding even from himself. I don't know what I believe anymore, he admitted. She nodded slowly, her expression softening. That's a beginning. And then, because the moment had stretched too long and the world was waiting, she turned and walked back toward the ballroom. The final segment of the evening arrived with the inevitability of a tide. Julian Voss took the stage, his handsome face glowing under the lights, his voice carrying the practiced warmth of a man who'd been assured his entire life that people wanted to hear what he had to say. Friends, donors, supporters, thank you for being here tonight. We're gathered to celebrate not just the future of the Marlowe Theatre, but the future of our great city. A future built on the foundation of our past, a future that honors the traditions that made us while embracing the innovations that will carry us forward. Evan listened to the words he'd helped craft and felt something hollow open in his chest. The script was perfect. The delivery was flawless. The applause that followed was enthusiastic and sustained. Julian continued, building toward the moment when he would announce Lumi, his community representative, his human shield against accusations of greed. The narrative had been carefully constructed. The game was proceeding according to plan. But Evan had just watched Lumi stand in the wings, her face calm and unreadable, and he realized, with a clarity that felt like the first breath after drowning, that she was about to burn it all down. He didn't know what she would say. He didn't know how she would say it. But he knew, with absolute certainty, that Lumi had not come here tonight to be anyone's puppet. The assistant appeared at his elbow. She's going on after Julian's introduction. 3 minutes. No deviations. We've got the feed ready to cut if needed. Evan looked at the assistant, a man he'd worked with a dozen times before, a man who thought they were on the same side, and felt the cold weight of the lie he'd been living. Is that the protocol? Evan asked. Cut her off if she says something you don't like? The assistant shrugged. It's insurance. Julian is very clear about how this needs to go. Of course he is. Evan turned back to the stage. Julian had reached his conclusion, the big announcement, the ribbon-cutting metaphor, the call for everyone to join hands in building a brighter tomorrow. He was gesturing toward the wings now, toward Lumi, and the spotlight was tracking across the stage to find her. And then she stepped into the light. The deep blue dress she wore caught the glow of the chandeliers and turned it into something liquid, something alive. She walked to the microphone with the same unhurried grace she'd brought to the corridor, to the vending machine, to the moment she'd calmed a drunk man with a glass of water. She looked like she belonged in a painting. She looked like she belonged in this room. And then she opened her mouth, and Evan realized she'd never belonged to any of it. "I've never owned a dress this expensive," she said, her voice carrying through the ballroom with the clear, steady tone of someone who'd learned to speak loud enough to be heard over the rain. A ripple of polite laughter. Julian's smile held. "And I'm pretty sure the people at the old theater would rather I use this money to fix the heater." The laughter died. The silence that followed was electric. Evan watched Julian's face shift, the mask of benevolence cracking just slightly at the edges. He watched the assistant's hand move toward the control board. He watched Lumi stand at the microphone, unflinching, as she began to tell the story she'd come here to tell. The children who couldn't afford to take lessons anywhere else. The single mother who'd found community in a rehearsal room with a leaking roof. The old man who still came every week to teach Shakespeare to anyone who would listen. The way the laughter in that battered old building had saved her, once, on a night when she thought she couldn't go on. "You call it redevelopment," Lumi said, her voice still calm, still clear. "I call it erasing a place where people who feel invisible are reminded they exist." She paused, and her eyes swept the room, past Julian, past the donors, past the journalists with their recorders and cameras. They found Evan, standing in the wings, his hand on the control board. The assistant was reaching for the mute button. Evan could see the movement in his peripheral vision, the urgency in the man's face. This was the moment he'd been paid to prevent. This was the moment that could destroy everything. Evan's hand moved. Not toward the mute button, but toward the volume slider. He pushed it up, just a fraction, not enough to be noticed but enough to ensure every word she said would be heard. Lumi's eyes held his for one more heartbeat, and in that heartbeat, something passed between them. Gratitude, yes. Relief, maybe. But also something else, a recognition, a shared understanding, a door opening in a room he'd thought was permanently locked. Then her eyes moved on, and she finished. "Simple can still be memorable," she said, her voice softening. "I hope you'll remember this night for what it really was." The silence that followed was a living thing, breathing and expanding, filling the room until it seemed like nothing else existed. And then, from somewhere near the back, a single pair of hands began to clap. It was a volunteer, one of the theater's old-timers. Evan recognized him, a man with worn hands and a worn jacket who'd probably taken the subway to get here because he couldn't afford a taxi. The clapping was quiet at first, solitary, but then it spread. Others joined in. The journalists first, then the younger donors, then the people who'd come because they actually cared about the theater, not because they cared about Julian's reputation. The applause built and swelled, and by the end, half the room was standing, and Lumi was still standing on the stage, her face lit by the glow of 100 chandeliers and 100 moments like the ones she described. Julian's face was a mask of frozen rage. The assistant was frantically whispering into his earpiece. The cameras were flashing, capturing everything. And Evan was standing in the wings, his hands still on the volume slider, feeling something he hadn't felt in years, the dangerous, thrilling, terrifying sensation of having done the right thing. The chaos that followed was predictable. Julian's team swarmed the stage, trying to contain the damage. The journalists descended like wolves. The volunteers from the theater had formed a protective circle around Lumi, not hostile, just present, a reminder of what she represented. Evan watched it all from the wings, his body humming with a nervous energy that felt alien after years of practiced calm. He just torched his career. He just made an enemy of one of the most powerful men in the city. He just, for the first time in longer than he could remember, chosen a side. And he didn't regret it. He didn't regret any of it. He pushed through the crowd, moving toward Lumi. She was surrounded by volunteers and journalists and the general chaos of a room in crisis, but she saw him coming, and she smiled, a real smile this time, not the public one she'd worn all evening, but something softer, something just for him. "I turned the microphone on," he said, reaching her. She laughed, a sound that cut through the noise of the room like a bell. "You turned it up." And then she took his hand, her fingers warm and steady in his. "Come on," she said. "Let's get out of here." They slipped through the chaos together, past the journalists and the volunteers and the remnants of Julian's team, out through a service exit that led to a narrow alley behind the hotel. The rain had stopped, finally, and the air was clean and cold, carrying the smell of wet concrete and the distant promise of morning. They stood in the alley, breathing hard, their hands still clasped. "I can't go back there," Lumi said, her voice suddenly trembling. "The theater, I have to go first thing." "I have to, someone else is going," Evan said. He'd made a call while she was still on stage, texted an old contact at the city's preservation office. "They're already sending someone to assess the damage. The roof will be tarped by morning." She stared at him. "How did you?" "Because I'm very good at my job," he said, and there was no bitterness in it now. "And I'm starting to learn that there are better ways to use that than making rich people feel comfortable." She was quiet for a moment, her eyes searching his face. Then she lifted her free hand, the one not clasped in his, and touched his cheek, her fingers cool against his skin. "I knew," she said softly. "When I saw you in that corridor, I knew you weren't like them." "How?" "I don't know." She smiled, a little ruefully. "You looked like you were waiting for permission to stop pretending." He laughed, a sound that surprised him. "That's surprisingly accurate." "Waiting is a form of listening," she said, echoing her words from earlier. "And I thought a crisis consultant would know that." He raised his free hand to cover hers, still pressed against his cheek. "I've been in the wrong job for a very long time," he said. "I think I'm finally ready to try something else." She nodded slowly. "Me too. I think we both have some work to do in the morning." He squeezed her hand. "Then I guess we'd better get some sleep." They started walking, not toward anything in particular, just away from the hotel and the chaos and the wreckage of Julian's carefully constructed narrative. The streets were quiet, the city settling into the deep hush that comes in the hours before dawn. They walked in silence for a while, and Evan found himself thinking, not for the first time, that Lumi was the most dangerous kind of person he'd ever met. Not because she was loud or aggressive or confrontational, but because she made you want to be better. She made you believe you could be. She looked at you with those quiet, knowing eyes and made you feel like the version of yourself you'd always hoped to become was actually possible. And when he thought about that, about the way her hand felt in his, about the way she'd refused to be anyone's puppet, about the way she'd torn down a facade he'd helped build with nothing but the truth, he realized he was falling in love with her. It was a ridiculous thought. He barely knew her. He'd only known her for a few hours. But there was something about her, something that felt like coming home to a place he'd never been, and he knew, with the same certainty he'd felt when he'd pushed that volume slider up, that he was going to follow wherever she led. They reached the corner of a street that overlooked the city, and Lumi stopped, looking out at the skyline that was just beginning to lighten at the edges. "What happens now?" she asked. He didn't answer for a long moment. He was watching the way the first light caught her profile, the way the deep blue of her dress softened into something almost lavender in the growing dawn. "We start again," he said finally. "You go back to the theater, and I go back to whatever kind of work I can find in the city that doesn't involve helping rich people destroy things." "I don't want to do this alone," she said, turning to look at him. "The rebuilding, the fighting, all of it. I don't want to do it alone." "Then don't." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she stepped closer and closer until she was close enough that he could feel the warmth of her, smell the scent of her, see the tiny flecks of gold in her eyes. And then she leaned up and kissed him, softly, on the corner of his mouth. It wasn't a passionate kiss, not yet. It was a promise, a commitment, a hope. It was the feeling of a door opening in a locked room. When she pulled back, she was smiling, and her eyes were bright. "Thank you," she said, "for not rescuing me too early." He laughed, a breathless sound. "I don't think I rescued you at all. I think you rescued yourself. Maybe." She took his hand again. "But you made sure everyone could hear me." They walked together through the quiet streets, their hands clasped, their footsteps falling into rhythm. The first light of dawn was spreading across the city, turning the sky from black to gray to pale gold, and somewhere in the distance, a bird began to sing. It was the beginning of something. Not the end, not the resolution, but the start of something new. And as they walked, Lumi's dress, that deep blue gown that had been bought to silence her, trailed behind her, stained with rainwater and sidewalk dirt, no longer a symbol of the cage she'd escaped, but a reminder of the night she'd refused to be anyone's puppet. The man who bought her dress couldn't buy her silence. And Evan Mercer had never been so grateful for anything in his entire life.
Subscribe to me for more content.